Welcome to Sober Sunrise, a podcast bringing you AA speaker meetings with stories of experience, strength, and hope from around the world. We bring you several new speakers weekly, so be sure to subscribe. We hope to always remain an ad-free podcast, so if you'd like to help us remain self-supporting, please visit our website at sober-sunrise.com. Whether you join us in the morning or at night, there's nothing better than a sober sunrise. We hope that you enjoy today's speaker.
Hi, everybody. I am Matt Cassidy. I'm a grateful recovered alcoholic, and as Dave said, he is my sponsor, so he's here to keep me honest. And God, I'm so nervous when I do one of these things, and I have to be 100% honest from the get-go. Nothing, not thrown up in a garbage pail or anything that nervous, but every fear inventory I've ever done, the fear of being unloved, unaccepted, looking like an ass in public, the fear of being found out, always turns up. So for me to get in front of a group of 56, you see that ego told me there was going to be 70 people here, so it's not as big of a crowd as I thought it was going to be. But sort of speak in front of this many people in an unfamiliar format, where it's like I'm not going to hear any feedback, no laughs when I say something I think to be funny, or I'm just going to look for head nods, when people identify. But the only planning I've done is I just, like Dave said, I'm here to share my story. And out of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, if you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of our 42 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me. Or more important, yes, I felt like that. Or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me too. I've also picked each individual in the personal stories describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way he established his relationship with God. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. If you have decided you want what we have and you're willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. And lastly, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Those four things kind of tell me exactly what I'm supposed to be doing here. I'm not into a drunkalog because my drinking career was not very long. It's not very entertaining, to be quite honest. But what it does have is it does have all of the aspects of alcoholism, which, I was taught by good sponsorship, when I'm sharing what it was like, I'm given about 45 minutes here. So what I used to be like is 1/3 of my story. So if I'm going past, 15, 18 minutes and I'm still talking about drinking, Dave, anybody, feel free to jump in and start heckling because, I'm talking too long about the problem and not enough about the solution, that solution being a God word, a word that I did not like when I first got here, and I'm sure I'll get to that. I'm also nervous because this is, like my second time talking in like in a year, and I'm sure I'll get to why that is, later on when I get to what my life is like now. But, not to scare you, Mark, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my childhood, but did not cause my alcoholism. It just has a lot to do with, the other person that I was. I was born into alcoholism. Like I shared, my last name is Cassidy. In case the pale skin and, premature graying hair does not give it away, I am Irish. If there's any doubt of that, I have a Celtic cross tattoo, I have a shamrock tattoo, and I have 2 leprechaun tattoos just to remind me on a daily basis of how Irish I am. But on both sides of the fence, on my mom's side and my dad's side, it's just filled with, alcoholics. It's, if you're not alcoholic in my family, you marry one just to fit in. And, everybody usually laughs at that, but it is 100% true because, I talk about 2 of my uncles, one of my uncles just died about 1.5 years ago with cirrhosis of the liver. But when my family talks about, Uncle Butch, they talk about how he died from an infection. Because if we talk about cirrhosis of the liver, then we'd all have to talk about what the real cause of that is, and that would be his alcoholism, that he literally drank himself to death. Another one of my uncles right now is out of it, lost his job due to his drinking. His wife threw him out of the house due to his drinking. He's bouncing in and out of sober houses because he can't stay sober. But we don't talk about him at all because if he's down on they just talk about him being down on his luck when his name does come up, and hopefully luck comes back to him. So it's either like the delusion that runs through my family, not denial, because denial is not wanting to believe the truth, but knowing it's the truth. My family, we lived in a lot of delusion of sick alcoholic behavior that was 100% acceptable. The at a young age, because I grew up in alcoholism, and I grew up with a a father who was physically abusive, mentally, verbally abusive. Because I grew up around alcoholism, my mom went into Al-Anon in 1984. So I did have exposure to the 12 steps at a real young age. And I remember, she told us, she sat down and told us that she had joined this organization called Al-Anon, and it was a 12-step fellowship, and she was going to do these 12 steps, and she was going to, get well. She explained to us that, she couldn't fix dad's drinking, which, you know, the funny thing about that is when she tells the story the way she tells it, which is probably the truth, that when she sat down to tell us all about my dad's alcoholism, is that, she said, dad has a problem. And my answer to her was, yeah, dad drinks too much. And I knew right away, I guess I could spot alcoholism from a mile away, because, even back then, I probably, I was definitely showing symptoms of it. I just wasn't drinking to fix it. I turned to food at an early age. At my heaviest, I was 5'8", 260 pounds. So, I guess you could say I always had a God-shaped hole. So I looked for anything and everything to fill that hole. But I never found anything that really fit that hole and took care of the bill until I found God. And so as a result of my as a result of growing up in that abusive household, and as a result of I was sexually abused by a next door neighbor at a young age. So I had that to deal with. Because of all that stuff that was going on in my life. I remember being just a young kid, and I was going to Catholic school at the time. So I remember thinking, if there was a God, and this is what he's doing to me, I want nothing to do with him. I definitely missed the mark on a loving and caring God that they were teaching in school. I would come to find that God in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's the God of my understanding today. But as a young kid, with no belief in a higher power, and just looking to fill that hole and looking for anything and everything outside of yourself. The you know I was never satisfied. I always like to tell the story that my mom got a job at a camp for rich people. Everybody whose dad was there was like a doctor or a lawyer. And they all made like four, 5-figure salaries back in the 80s. And my mom got a job there, so we got to go for free. And when we started going there, I remember crying that I didn't want to go because I didn't like it. And then when she quit that job and we couldn't go there anymore, I remember crying because now I couldn't go anymore. So I was never happy, regardless of what was going on the outside. I'll fast forward to 1994. The my senior year of high school. This is Alcoholics Anonymous. I do respect the fifth tradition and the third tradition. Is that this is this is about alcohol and alcoholism, but dry goods are a part of my story. And it was Donnie who spoke a couple of weeks ago, who for the first time in my life put it in perspective for me. In the book, it talks about how we used different methods of to control our drinking, and I believe, after hearing him, I was using truckloads of dry goods just to treat that alcoholism, because I had made this promise to myself as a little kid that I would not be an alcoholic. So I had exposure to drinking, but I really didn't want to do it to excess, because then I had this fear that I would become an alcoholic like everybody else in my family. So I used other substances to treat my alcoholism, and they work because they take care of the restless irritable discontent that I feel when I have nothing in my body. But you fast forward to my senior year of high school, and I was at a party, and everybody there was drinking, and I knew they were drinking, and so I was like, all right, I better drink to fit in, because I had that chameleon side of me before I knew it was going on, before I knew it was a side of me. So I remember drinking that night. So it's like the first time I'm really drinking and I'm getting drunk. And I remember it clear as day, because I hadn't hit the blackout yet. But I remember sometime during the party, I was drinking out of a glass, because I just knew internally, if you drink out of a bottle, that makes you alcoholic. So I had to drink out of a glass, so I had to look high class, so uh, I dropped the glass, it shattered on the floor. And I remember still to this day, my first thought was, I was embarrassed because everybody looked at me. And then I was mad because I just wasted alcohol. But then I was relieved when the next thought was there was still plenty more in the fridge, so I know even, from that early point that, I had, the physical allergy, because I know I needed more. Once I put it in my body, I would need more. So, that story proves that I have the physical allergy aspect of this disease, which Dr. Silkworth says, makes us alcoholic. You know, my drinking just got worse because this is a progressive illness, so, I was, I had some time to think about this talk before I made it. And the more I thought about it, the more stories that came back to me, and, just like how I could see, like, the progression of my illness, and like I said, I talk to my mom often, and, she still goes to Al-Anon. So I shared with her one of the stories, and she's like, "You gonna share that in your talk?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess so." Cause, it produced, an effect on you. So, I told her a story of how, somebody down the hall from me in college brought a bottle down. I was like, "Hey, you want to try this?" So by that time I'd already developed the mental obsession. So my mind goes, yeah, we never had that. We got to try it, even though I know I had work before, but I still thought at that time that I can control my drinking. So I'll just have one or two, and then I'll, have enough time before I go to work. But of course, one led to two, led to three, led to, more and more. And then I was like, oh crap, I got to go to work. So I call my boss and I tell him that I was like, oh yeah, I can't come into work today. He's like, oh no, what's the matter? He was actually showing true concern. And I said, oh, I hurt my shoulder. I couldn't just, it couldn't just come with an easy excuse like I don't feel good. It's like, I had to come with something like, big, so to make him really feel sorry for me. He's like, oh, I hurt my shoulder. He's like, oh, okay. He's like, he's like, well, he's like, I hope it gets better. We'll see you around. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, thanks. So the next day when I woke up, I worked in the building where the school cafeteria was. So now I realized that I would have to walk past my boss on my way to go to breakfast at the cafeteria. And I just told him I hurt my shoulder. So to cover the lie with yet another lie, I actually took my shoulder and I bashed it up against the bedpost of my bed until it was black and blue, so that I could stop at the infirmary on my way to the cafeteria, so that they would give me a sling or give me an ice pack or give me something, and I was just like, and that story came back to me. I was like, oh my God. I was like, the lies that the lengths that I went to have to cover up my lies. Another time that I thought of is, I went to get out of bed one morning after a heavy night of drinking, and I went to stand up and I keeled over like a Jenga board. I fell flat on my face, and when I looked down at my ankle, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I did something to my ankle, which would explain why it's the size of a grapefruit and purple like a grape. I was like, now it all makes sense why I can't stand up. So there was another time that, I mean, there's a questionnaire on our SIA meeting list up here, for Suffolk County that says, did you ever wind up in a hospital due to your drinking? So I always thought when I first saw that list that it meant, did I wind up in detox and rehab? And I could say, oh no. But the more I thought honestly about my drinking, I was like, yeah, I did wind up in the hospital numerous times because of my drinking. So I could easily change my answer to yes on that one. So my drinking just got worse. It was like there were times like, I went to a family party. It was my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, and they had an open bar, because like I said, we're surrounded by alcoholics. So what would a party be without an open bar? And I remember walking up to it, and the somebody was nice enough to list all of the beers, and most people would look at that as I have choice. I could have this one, or I could have that one, or I could have the liquor on the top shelf. So most people look at it as choice. I looked at the list up on the wall as a mission statement. I had to go from top to bottom and back up to the top if I had enough time. So, and that's what I did for the night. I went down the list. I went back up. In between, I threw in some hard liquor because they did. Again, they had to have the top shelf stuff. None of that cheap stuff. For a Cassidy family affair. But I'll just fast forward to my last drunk. My last drunk was nothing, you know, exciting, nothing spectacular, to be quite honest. But what did happen to me that night was I needed the last piece of the puzzle that I could see clearly, so that I could know how much trouble I was in. That night I was going to a party, and it was about an hour and a half drive from my house. So I sat in my driveway, getting ready to leave for the party. And I remember making a solemn oath to myself, like Bill talks about in the book. We make solemn oaths with or without a Bible. Okay, I didn't have a Bible handy, but if I did, I probably would have sworn on it that tonight I was not going to take a drink. Okay, it's not that I didn't want to drink, but by this time, everybody was calling me alcoholic, except me. So I was not going to drink that night to prove to everybody that I wasn't alcoholic. So if you've ever had to prove to somebody that you're not alcoholic, you're probably alcoholic, in case there's anybody out there who has any doubt. So I leave for the party and I'm not going to drink. Okay. It takes about 45 minutes to get from my house to the next county line. By the time I got to the next county line, I remember clearly the thought that crossed my mind. Okay. The thought that crossed my mind, not that I had to make up any, not that I had to like think about it. It just popped into my head. It was, it's going to be a 6 hour party. If we go to a 6 hour party and we buy a 6 pack and we drink one beer an hour, that's social drinking. That's not alcohol. So you can still drink and you can still prove to everybody that you're not alcoholic because you can show them that you can control your drinking. And that I know today is the mental obsession, that missing piece of being the true alcoholic on page 21. I went to the party that night and I went and I bought a 6 pack and, just, I tore off all the labels, and I made this grandiose announcement to everybody because, when I speak, everybody listens, so, that there's a 6 pack in the fridge, nobody drink it. Those are mine, and it was like about 20, 25 minutes later, somebody goes walking past with a beer without a label on it. And I was like, that's my beer. They don't listen to me. Who the hell are these people? Well, screw them. Then if they're drinking my beer, then I'm going to drink all theirs, so then, off to the races I went. So when I woke up the next morning, you know, I was like, where was my thought of not drinking when the time came? Where was all of my willpower? It was not, I knew it was non-existent. It was the first moment of clarity out of many that I would have, in sobriety. And that was the morning of May the 5th of 1996. And I'm, proud to say due to God's grace and good sponsorship and the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, that's still my sobriety date. So I'm an Irish guy, I don't know about up in Canada, but down here in the United States, on St. Patrick's Day, everybody pretends to be Irish, so they can drink. And on Cinco de Mayo, May the 5th, everybody pretends to be Mexican so they could drink. So I'm the Irish guy who got sober on a Mexican holiday. So if I ever come across in sobriety the Mexican guy who got sober on St. Patrick's Day, I'm telling you right now, him and I are going to start a big book study. Okay, Scout's honor. Okay, so I see my buddy Charlie laughing because St. Patrick's Day is his sobriety date, but he's Irish, so it doesn't count. um, but so there I was, stone cold sober now, not, and not wanting to take another drink. But it took me 2 weeks to be convinced that I still couldn't do it myself. I remember driving around one night, and I was just like, I'm going to drive around to every 7-Eleven and just drink coffee. And I drove around to every 7-Eleven, out by my house, and I probably drank, I'm still, I still got an alcoholic mind. It's just not alcohol because I was only 19 at the time. So I couldn't go into 7-Eleven and buy beer. So I couldn't buy a small coffee. I had to buy the large coffee, so that I drove to like 8 7-Elevens drinking like 8 20-ounce cups of coffee, wondering why my hands were shaking and why I couldn't sleep that night. I think that's like equal to an urn. I'm not exactly sure. But so I wind up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, at some meetings, because at that time I was also in the rooms of Al-Anon, because like I told you, my mom was in Al-Anon. So I thought my dad's drinking was my problem. So if I went to Al-Anon, I could, I could work on myself like my mom worked on myself, worked on herself, and things would be okay. But the problem was, in between when I got sober and, before I got sober, I went to an Al-Anon conference and I found myself nodding in agreement with the AA speaker. So I was like, so even then, like, that was another moment of clarity. Before I stopped drinking, I was like, why am I relating to an alcoholic? It was like, red flags along the way, but I never saw them. So I'm sitting in the rooms of AA. I go to my very first meeting, closed meeting, and I'm like, I'm Matt, and I think I'm an alcoholic, and they let me ramble on for a little bit, and then when I was all done, the speaker just goes, Matt, if you think you're an alcoholic, you probably are one, because normal people don't sit around and wonder if they're alcoholic. So I was kind of let down by that, because I was kind of hoping he'd let me off the hook, and like, like after I had talked, like, no, you're not alcoholic. But he kind of like, put the final, final nail in my coffin. God started doing for me what I could not do for myself, because my first sponsor, I walked in the room that night after I shared, and I knew he was going to be my sponsor. So it's the little miracle started to happen along the way. you know um Unfortunately, part of my story was the first 4 months of my sobriety. I was hanging out with a crowd that was just simply don't drink, go to meetings, hang out at the diner, go to, join the softball team. I remember sharing one night that, I want to do my fourth and fifth step, and somebody telling me you're not sober enough to do a fourth and fifth step. You don't have enough time. So those were the type of people that, that I was surrounded with. So, you know, I was about 100 days sober. I moved from New York down to North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina, to go back to college. So I knew that I needed to plug into the fellowship down there. So I started going to meetings in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I was about 100 days sober. Sitting in the rooms of AA, dying of untreated alcoholism, and not knowing what my problem was. But down there, if you've never been down to North Carolina, my experience is, especially the Greensboro Triad area, they're big book country. They talk straight out the book. They quote the book. That everybody carries a book. So it's like, so all of a sudden I see these people walking around carrying big books, walking in a room, sharing out the big book, carrying a big book message. And I was like, what are these people talking about? I mean, it's like I read the first 164 pages because somebody told me to read it, and I read it like a book, and there was no surprise ending. There was no, there was no plot twist going on. It was like some guy named Bill and some guy named Bob, and but other than that, I was just like, some guy named Fred, and I just didn't get it because nobody ever explained to me that it was a basic text. It was a textbook, something that was meant to be studied. It was something that meant to be applied. You know, the my second sponsor that I met down in North Carolina, by the name of Joe J. I certainly hope he was able to make the meeting tonight because I gave him the link. But when I met him, you know, he actually sat down with me and showed me the cover. He showed me the big book, and then he opened it up to the cover page, and he goes, look, he goes, this is Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many of thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. He was the first person to show me that I could recover from this disease, that I was not always going to be sick from it, that I could get well. You know, he explained to me that that was the book that him and I would be reading together. He said we'd be getting together once a week to do some reading and do some step work. I don't know what night of the week I met him, but the first weekend that I was with him, oh, and he goes, we'll go to a rehab. So you can meet some other people. And we show up to the rehab, and they're like, Joe, are you speaking today? He goes, no, you need a speaker. He goes, yeah. He goes, this is Matt. He just moved here from New York. He's your speaker for today. So he kind of like threw me right into service work too. Working with others. I just remember sitting down with him and, going through the book, and, he did to me what he was supposed to do. He qualified me as an alcoholic. He made sure that I had mental obsession. He made sure that I had physical craving. He made sure that I knew exactly how screwed I was. He made sure that I understood that AA was the last house on the block for me, that if there was any way that I could stop drinking on my own, I probably had already tried it and it did not work. He reminded me of such mean things like, I came to AA. AA did not come to me. It's not like they knocked on my door and begged me for membership. You know, so just the way that he lovingly crushed my ego, because that's what I needed in order to get well. I needed to be told in a loving, caring way that, that I had a problem and that AA was the only answer that he had to offer. He said he was going to give me the 12 steps of recovery, which is the only thing he had to offer because it was the only thing he had, and I remember when he first gave me that talk, I remember saying to him that I know it works for you. I know it works for your sponsor. I said, but I really don't know if it's going to work for me. And he pointed out to me, he goes, Matt, you haven't worked the 12 steps yet. He goes, why don't you work them and see if they don't work for you? He says, before you have an opinion on it. So I agreed to do that. I agreed to work the 12 steps. At that time, again, he also shoved me into service work, you know, there was a young people's conference that people were trying to build down there at the time. There was a really young, really hardcore young people's movement at the time. There was a bunch of us young people, who, newly in sobriety. We only had like a couple of years max, but you know, we all we all had a common purpose. We wanted to put on this convention. So we got into service work. We got into going to different meetings and carrying a message. We got into, grabbing other people's like, hey, you just shared a meeting that you got nothing to do, or you're bored in sobriety. Why don't you come help us? And so around me, the fellowship that I craved started to grow up around me. All I had to do was show up and to be a part of it. I was involved with that. I was going through the step work with Joe, and I remember the first fifth step. He says to me, he goes, well, it's your first fifth step, so he goes, you get to pick the location where we're going to do it. He goes, I just want to make sure that you're comfortable. And the only answer I could come up with, I said, well, why don't we do it in my apartment? And he's like, okay, if that's where you feel comfortable. I was like, yeah. I was like, that's where I feel comfortable, because in the back of my head was, when I'm done with this, he can't throw me out because it's my apartment. And that's the only reason why I want to do it there. because I had this big fear of when I opened myself up to another human being for the first time in my life. I had this fear of rejection. But when we went through that fifth step, all I found was a loving, caring person who understood where I came from and was there just to help me, see my defects of character, to see the things within me that blocked me off from God. You know, um, when I when that school year ended, the I had gotten a call from my parents because my dad was like, "I'm starting to think about retirement, and what do you think my biggest expenditure was?" And I was like, out of state tuition." And he's like, "Yeah, it is." So he said, he goes, "So you're going to come home?" He said, "We'll send you to a local college." He said, "But you're not going to go to school out of state anymore." So I was like, "Okay." I was like, "So I get to go to college, but just not this college." He's like, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." I really can't argue with that. So I had to move back from North Carolina, and I came back to New York, and I was trying to carry that big book message. It's like, "Hey guys, here's what's in the book. Here's what it says. Look, we can be recovered and stuff." And I was met with a lot of resistance, from a lot of people. And unfortunately, over time, rather than care more about God's will for me, which is to help others, I started to care more about fitting in and more. So by the time I was done with college, I met my soon to be wife. So we'd started dating. So I had a fiance. Then that we got married. Then I got a house, and I changed jobs into a better job. So I had all this stuff going for me in life. So so I was kind of shifting away from giving everything to God, and I wanted to take credit for it, and I wanted to enjoy the life that I was being given. And I slowly turned into a, don't drink and go to meetings guy. I was working with people, but I wasn't exactly taking them through taking them through the book. I was kind of like, cutting corners, and, the, I'm not proud of that period of my sobriety because, it was, if I ever heard it, I forgot it. But, Dave told me the other day, it's sobriety, not sobriety. That I was, he uses the expression, I was so dry, I was a fire hazard. And, I could definitely agree with that. So, you know, needless to say, over time, you know, the it says in the book that I'm in the grips of a progressive illness. It says nothing about it's only progressive when I'm drinking. I know today my alcoholism gets worse even when I'm not drinking. So the spiritual malady was starting to come back. And it's like I know today the spiritual malady, if left untreated, makes fertile ground for the mental obsession, a mental obsession that I have no treatment for. I can't use the broken mind to be defensive against that first drink. It has to come from a higher power. So I was probably in a lot more danger than I knew of. And it was around this time that I knew the answer was in the book. So I was just like, you know what, I was like, whether I'm, going to be liked or I'm not going to be liked is none of my business. It's what God wants me to do, helping others. So I went and I bought a brand new big book because at the time I was walking around, still my third edition big book, because I got sober in 96 and the fourth edition wasn't published until 2001. So I used to walk around my third edition to show just how sober I was. I would use it like a badge of honor, so I went and I bought a brand new fourth edition big book. And I know that in the book, I'm like, all right, I know there's beliefs I'm supposed to have. I know that there's steps I'm supposed to take. I know that there's action that's supposed to be done. And most importantly, I know that there's promises in this book. I don't know about up in Canada or any other parts of the United States where some of you folks are, but in meetings down here, they'll close meetings with reading the promises. And they read the ninth step promises. And yeah, there go the hair on the back of my neck while I'm saying it. It just drives me nuts. I'm like, you folks have no idea if you think that those 12 promises are the only ones in the book. There's third step promises, there are 10th step promises. There are promises where they don't even need to be more promises. So I came with this crazy highlighter scheme, just because I wanted to do it perfect, of course, because an alcoholic can't ever settle for moderation. So I highlighted this new book, and where it said I was action to take, I took action. And where it said there's a prayer, I got down on my knees and I said those prayers. And it was around this time where I went to a big book convention, and Chris R was the speaker. So I went up to him after the meeting because I knew he had he was friends with Dave. So I was like, I went up to him after the meeting. I was like, hey, I was like, can you give me Dave Frederickson's phone number? I said, I'd like to reach out to him and talk with him. so because Dave got sober at 19, I got sober at 19, so, I knew there was stuff that we'd have in common. So, Chris goes, all right, I don't give away a phone number without taking one in return. He says, so he goes, I'll give you Dave's phone number, but you got to give me yours. So I said, okay, sure, no problem. I'm like I'll ever hear from Chris Raymer. It's like my phone will ever ring with him on the other end. But hey, he asked for it, so I gave it to him. So I reached out to Dave, and like you said, that was 2010. I literally stalked him. At the time, he was working he'd be working out of New York. So I'd go visit him before he had to go to work. I'd meet him at the airport. And we'd have like 45-minute chat or something. So, like I said, it probably qualifies as stalking, but it was definitely good times. And you know and I, fast forward a couple of years, my first kid was born. I'm like, you know what? I'm like, my life is changing. So I decided to change sponsors. I asked Dave to sponsor me. And, if you ever ask Dave to work with you, Dave has a plethora of spiritual exercises to give you. A yes from Dave never comes lightly. So off I came on like a new spiritual journey with, these things to do. And, so I started doing these exercises, and like, no big surprise. You start doing spiritual exercise, you start getting spiritually fit. You start getting spiritually fit, and you start carrying a message of depth and weight. So I was going to meetings and I was sharing. I'd open a Matt Cassidy, and people were like, why does he got to share his last name? And I'm a recovered alcoholic. Why does he say he's recovered? I was like, there was one cranky old timer who had almost 40 years of sobriety, who used to introduce himself. I'm so and so. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and he like yell it while locking eyes with me. And I was like, doesn't this dude know that I've resigned from debating society? I was like, I really don't care what he thinks. Again, I got more pushback. But at that time in my life, I cared more about saving lives than I cared about being liked. And again, what happened was those people who liked what I shared and those people who identified with me, those were the people I started hanging out with. Again, so the fellowship I craved started to bounce up around me. My son was born in 2011, and that was the first sign that that a God of my understanding truly trusted me, because when I got sober, I couldn't even take care of myself. You fast forward, I was you know I was 14 years sober, and I'm like, so at 14 years sober, God gave me another human being to take care of. I know today God trusts me with one of his kids to take care of. He's not my kid, he's God's kid. I'm just here to steer him on the right path. And my daughter was born in 2015, and she's just she's a handful and a half, so she's 4 now. And so she's another blessing, in my life. But I don't know how much truth was going to come out of me, but apparently God wants me to talk about it. After my daughter was born, about a couple weeks after my daughter was born, all of a sudden, like, I was like forever tired, and all of a sudden I wanted like nothing to do with my daughter. I wanted nothing to do with my wife. I wanted nothing to do with, I was not picking up phone calls. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I would go to my home group to chair a meeting, and people would just take one look at me and they're like, are you okay? You should probably go see a doctor. Because I looked horrendous. I was, in 10 days, I lost 10 pounds. There was something going on. And, I go to the emergency room one night, and I'm just like, and I give them all my symptoms and everything. And they took blood tests, and everything came back negative. And the doctor goes, I have no idea what's going on with you. He's like, just, they discharged me from the emergency room with just a, goodbye and good luck, and when I got home the next day, I get a phone call from a family friend who's a nurse practitioner, because apparently my wife, behind my back, called my mom, and told her what was going on. My mom in turn behind my back calls this family friend who's a nurse practitioner. And so she calls me, she's like, Matt, I'd just like to talk to you for a little bit, because, everybody's concerned about, what's going on with you. So I'm like, okay. So, I'm talking to her, I'm telling her what's going on. And I'm like, and I tell her I went to the emergency room, and they gave me a blood test. And so they put me on it. The only thing that they had to offer me was they put me on an antibiotic for like any exotic, like bug bites, so if I happen to come down with like the first case of malaria since 1917, I would have been okay, but they had no idea, what was going on with me. And so when the conversation was ended, she goes, Matt, she goes, I've listened to everything you said. She goes, in case you don't notice, she goes, you're not even breathing. She goes, you take a light breath. She goes, and then you're sighing out after every breath. She goes, Matt, she goes, you're showing signs of depression, and she's like, whether you know it or not, and like in my mind, I'm like, I'm a step guy, I do the steps, and, I should be fine. And, that there should be nothing going on. And at first I was closed minded, and she's like, and then she threw in like a little sales pitch. She's like, I'm not here to treat you. I'm just here to guide you. I'm here to help you in whichever way you want. So I was like, you know what? I was like, everything I've tried doesn't work, and I've gone to everybody. I've gone to doctors, and they have no idea. So I guess I'll just give it a shot. And so I was kind of open minded, to being treated for something different. For something different. And again, it was another disease that I didn't want. But obviously I was showing symptoms of it, so maybe I would need to be treated for it. So she did put me on a medication. And I know today that, that is another problem, and it is a problem outside of alcoholism. And I guess the only reason why I'm sharing, guys got me sharing from a podium, is because if there's anybody else going through anything, that, there are problems other than alcoholism. It does say in the book, in the, in the 130s, that, God does give us, good doctors, to treat us or something like that. I am paraphrasing, because I'm not a big book, memorizer guy, but so there are doctors out there to help you if you do have other problems. Don't think, just because you're taking the 12 steps, that if you've got problems other than, I like to use the analogy, so if I was a diabetic, do I take the 12 steps to take care of my insulin, problem, or can I just, take some insulin and treat that outside issue, because, with outside, fixing. So, God, like I said, I guess God wanted me to be a lot more honest than I planned on being. um, but so what it's like now, what my life is like now is I do treat that outside stuff with, with outside help. I actually did have a therapy session before this today, and due to this whole COVID thing, I'm doing a Zoom meeting now with, oh, it's only 57 people. We're still not at 70. My ego's really let down. But the I had to do a Zoom, teletherapy meeting today. So like my entire life, today is like almost Zoom. And just I'm actually loving this format, because I used to love going to my home group, in person. By the way, my home group is the Longwood Love and Service Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. We meet in Ridge, New York, on Tuesdays and Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. So if anybody's ever in the area and you'd like to, fellowship, I did say didn't write down any notes, but I just lied again before, so I'll make amends to that. I wrote a note that says give email address. So my email address was in the chat room. So if any of you guys see the MFC50596 at AOL.com, that's my email address. Feel free to shoot me a letter, because the one thing that has come out of this whole Zoom thing is I now have friends in, obviously, Alberta, Canada. Hey, Mark, giving them a shout out. I made friends with, Cody, who spoke a couple weeks ago out of Seattle, Washington. I see my buddy Charlie, from Greensboro, North Carolina on here. So I'm like connecting with people, in all parts of the United States. When I actually spoke to Mark on the phone for the first time, and it's, we, again, like it says in the book, we're people that do not mix. I'm talking to a Canadian on the phone who lives in he's the first person I ever talked to in mountain, who lives in Mountain Time. But with that solidified, I now have a friend in every time zone. And, to me, I was like, that's the coolest. So thanks, Mark, for your friendship, so we can take care of that last time zone. And, this whole Zoom thing has been a trip. I did say I would, the reason why I haven't talked much is, you rewind about 8, 9 months ago, and I slowly started to pull away from, my home group. I slowly started to pull away from the fellowship. I had a resentment against my home group. Something was going down that I didn't like. And, rather than bring it to a business meeting and voicing my concern, and, who knows, maybe it become group conscience or whatever, I got a resentment. And the first thing I stopped doing is I stopped sharing at meetings. And then I realized it was like, wait a minute, I'm not doing too much step work lately, so I really can't share anything because I don't have current experience, so I kind of justified not sharing also. And so I stopped sharing at the meeting. And then I started putting other stuff in life ahead of, the fellowship. And, so I started dwindling down. And, as Dave and I have had many discussions, my magic number of meetings, plural, so it's supposed to be minimum 2, hence the English language of adding an S on the end. It has to be a plural. My minimum number of meetings slipped below 2, so I was only making 1 meeting a week. So I wasn't even doing that. And then 1 easily turns into 0. So so I'm not partaking in the fellowship. So I'm not staying in the middle of the herd. The I'm not talking to my sponsor. I'm not sponsoring. My last sponsee disappeared into the clouds of Never Land. So I'm not really doing anything. And again, ego starts to come back. That Dave calls it spiritual plaque. It's like the spiritual plaque started to come back, and it's like all of a sudden, I'm living a life that I think is great because I'm not drinking, so therefore I got to be doing good. And I'm slowly slipping back through the steps. I'm way back into the 3rd step, where if the world would do what I want, everything would be okay. And I probably came the closest I ever came to a drink in my life, back in January. I was actually, I went away to a, karate convention slash competition, and everybody else that I was hanging out with, they wanted to hang out in the bar. And, I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I can go to a bar. I've gone to a bar a million times. Well, our book says that you can go to a bar, number 1, if you have a legitimate reason for being there. And number 2, if you're on a firm spiritual foundation. Well, I had a legitimate reason to be there because everybody else was going there and I got to fit in. But I was certainly not on a firm spiritual foundation. And I was sitting in a bar, and I'm just like, I was probably the most miserable person in there. And what proof do I need of that? Okay. Is that the fact that a woman who was talking to the group actually came up to me and goes, that guy looks like he's having fun. And he pointed to my friend Ron. He goes, but you look miserable. And of course, what does a good alcoholic do? We're sensitive people. It says in the 12 and 12 that it takes us a while to grow out of that sensitivity. So I took it personal, even though she's telling the truth. And, and I turned into a resentment, so I left the bar because I didn't want to be in the same room with this woman anymore. So I think God actually saved my life through a resentment, because I walked out of there because, like I said, that's probably the closest I would ever be to a drink again. I hope ever again, because the only thing that was keeping me sober at that moment was ego. Because I was, I'll be 24 years sober in May, and here it is in January, and I'm already projecting 4 months into the future. Ego can only last that long. That strange mental blank spot probably would have took over sooner or later, and a thought would have crossed my mind because I have no defense. I probably would have drank. Again, Dave, one of the spiritual exercises Dave gave me was, he had me write down a miracles list. And of course that made the list, that I stayed sober during this, during this past dry spell. It's only, I joke now, it took a global pandemic to get me back to my home group. It was, the funny thing about it was I lost the power of choice to not go to meetings anymore. I couldn't go to a meeting anymore. So, so I knew that they had this Zoom format, and I found out from somebody who had the link, it was like, how do I get to our meetings? So they sent me the link. So I showed up, and the first thing that happened was, number 1, a lot of the people, they don't care why I was gone. They were just like, hey, we're glad to have you back. And a couple of years ago, I was on my home group's steering committee on making our group conscience because we were kind of off the rails a little bit, and they wanted to, get us back on track. So they're like, hey, let's have a steering committee, and let's actually put, pen to paper and, come up with our group conscience so that we know what it is instead of it being word of mouth. So I was, so being one of the old timers in the group who had actually been around the group for a long time, I wasn't a founding member of the group, but I was part of the first, the first wave of, membership, run pledging committee. So we put together group conscience, and, and that group conscience, a lot of it still stands today. So with this whole new Zoom format, they were like, hey, we need a little bit of a change here. And I jumped right up to the plate. I said, well, I happen on my computer, I still have the, all the openings to all the meetings, because when we left our church, meeting place, all the books were there. So everybody was just kind of like going by memory of like how to open up a meeting. And, I was like, I still got it on my computer. I'll be more than happy to update it, for any current, changes we have. I'll get rid of the stuff that doesn't apply, and I'll add stuff that does apply. So I changed, I changed all the openings, for the new Zoom format. So I immediately jumped back into service for my home group. This the Zoom format, like I said, allows me to meet new people in new different places. I mean, I go to a meeting. There's one Friday night. I'm like, oh, let me go to a meeting tomorrow. Oh, there's a Saturday morning as Bill sees it meeting, and I'm like, I'm not a, I like Bill's writing. I like Bill as a person. So I'm like, all right, maybe it'll, I'll go sit on that. Who knows how it's going to be. So I went and I joined in on that meeting, and there was a whole bunch of people bitching about, oh, this COVID thing and this isolation, and I'm stuck in the house with my kids, and somebody take my kid, somebody come and take my kids. And by this point, like I said, I'm already working with Dave again, and Dave's giving me spiritual exercise. I'm plugged back into service work. I'm plugged back into my home group, and I'm like, you know what? I guess it's time to either not be liked because it's time to be of service. So when it came my turn to share, I was like, yeah, I'm in a house with my wife who's working from home, and I'm in a house with a 4-year-old, who's not getting her special needs, stuff. I said, I'm in a house with an 8-year-old. I says, whose hobby is to not listen and make me repeat myself about 1,000 times a day. I said, but I said, my sponsor, I says, has me working spiritual exercise. I says, he has me working with 12 daily prayers and 12 daily meditations. I was like, the first of which, I says, comes right out of the big book. It's in the 9th step. It says that we ask God to show us the way of patience, tolerance, kindness, of love for each member of the family, and he had me sit with that. And what does it look like towards each member of the family? So it showed me that I could be of service to my family. It's like, so if I'm the first one up in the morning, it's easy to either pour my son a bowl of cereal or to make him a cheese omelet. It's easy to make my wife, breakfast. I can make my daughter breakfast, and but the whole thing about that was when I first started doing it, I was like, I'm doing service, but I'm not getting what I want in return. I found out there's still a lot of ego in the picture. I was like, I wanted, when I come down the stairs, I wanted to be greeted by that, Canyon of Heroes ticket tape parade welcome. It's like, oh, he's here to do service to us. He's so great. Instead I remembered, oh, that's right. Service is a thankless position. Like I said, my introduction to service, was, being thrown in front of a rehab by that guy, Joe. He also taught me that service, my introduction to service with him, was, one day, he tells me that because he asked me point blank when I was going to be a giver. He pointed out to me that I was a taker my whole life. When are you going to be a giver? And I was like, I don't understand what you mean. What do you mean by that? And he goes, I want to know when are you going to do something for somebody and look for nothing in return? And that was a concept to me that I needed more explanation. And because I said to him, I said, well, I did do service. I said, this, and now I'm going to date myself. I dumped my ashtray after the meeting. I says, I threw out my coffee cup after the meeting. I said, I cleaned up. So he brought to my attention that dumping an ashtray that I smoked out of, dumping a coffee cup that I drinked out of, and pushing in a chair that my ass occupied for the meeting was not service work. That just means that my mother raised me right. He said, go dump somebody else's ashtray, push somebody else's chair in. He says, and throw out somebody else's coffee cup. He goes, go do for somebody else and look for nothing in return. Don't look for an attaboy. Don't look for accolades. He goes, just do it because it's it's giving without a price tag. Like I said, Dr. Bob said in his final talk that the 12 steps boil down to, two things, love and service. And that's why I belong to a group called Love and Service. That's what the whole deal's about. I'm going to come to love God's children, and I'm going to want to be of service to them. That 12th step, was explained to me, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. So I'm guaranteed to get the only thing that's going to solve my problem. That's how We Agnostics chapter starts off with. If you're alcoholic, you may be suffering from a malady which only a spiritual experience will conquer. So it doesn't leave much room for what I need to get well. But that's, Joe pointed out to me that it was guaranteed to me as a result of the 12 steps. I have to do the 12 steps. If I don't do the 12 steps, then I'm not going to get well. It's not how many meetings I make. Derek, I'm going to quote Cliff, man, because I love it. Like Cliff Bishop used to say, it's not the meetings we make, it's the steps we take. That get us sober. I never met the man, but God, did I fall in love with a whole lot of stuff that he had to say. And The other thing I got, like I said, Chris Raymer took my number at that conference, and just to just to give a shout out to the guy who got me in this trouble to begin with. My buddy Derek, who spoke last week, and who's on here tonight. The I kind of alluded to it last week, but I'm at work one night and I get a phone call out of the blue, and of course I don't answer it because it's a strange area code. But when I get a voicemail from it, it's some guy from Kansas who's visiting New York who wants to get, who got my number from Chris. And I was like, holy crap. I was like, so when you give your number away, don't be surprised if somebody ever uses it. So I had to give this guy a call back because I've given my number away 1,000 times face to face, and never, if I'm lucky, I get a phone call 10 times out of 1,000. And I gave my number to this guy who gave it to this guy, and he called me, and we've been buds ever since. He flew up here on his own dime last summer, when I got to renew my wedding vows with my wife for our 15th anniversary. It's cool when you can, it says in the book that, we're going to commence shoulder to shoulder with people, and we're going to form lifelong bonds. And it's like, that's, when I think of him, I know that that's true. When I think of guys like Charlie, I know that's true because we've been friends for, over 2 decades now. We may not see each other all the time. We may not talk all the time, but, you can truly form friendships, and I love this Zoom format again, because, out of that meeting that I went to that Saturday morning, and I shared I just shared, some spirituality, and I dumped some God into the mix. I share another thing that Dave has me do. He has me call 6 alcoholics a day, and it's like, again, you work with Dave, but the bar can't be set low. It's got to be a pole vault level. So it's like, I'll not want to call 6 people, but it's like, if I call him, I know one of the things he's going to ask me is how my 6 going to go. So I got Cody, who spoke a couple weeks ago, also works with Dave. So, I kind of cheat a little bit. I'd make Cody one of my 6. Cody's got open liberty to make me, one of his 6, and, so when I shared, I call 6 people a day. This guy from out by Toronto shoots me a private message that he wants to talk, and like I said, God puts you on the firing lines when you're ready to show up. So I got a sponsee over out of this Zoom. So I show up on the firing lines, and God, like I said, God, I get back involved in my home group. I get back involved in my sponsor. I get back into spiritual exercises. God throws me out on the firing lines. I picked up him. He throws my name and number to a friend of his. Another friend of his, wants me to take him through the work. So I went from 0 to 2 in less than a week and a half. So God certainly does have a sense of humor, and He knows how to make us another exercise that Dave had me do, and I just finished it today, is, he has, in the book, it says the wording, of course, is quite optional when it talks about the third step. So I wrote my own third step prayer, again today, so I can pump up my prayer and meditation life, so I'm going to start. I actually work with that before the meeting, because I was like, all right, God, I wrote the prayer. Let's see how effective it is, and I got down on my knees, and my wife was tucking in our daughter. My son was upstairs on his iPad. So, I'm still too cool to be caught praying. So I made sure that everybody was busy before I got down on my knees. I got down on my knees, and said my version of the third step prayer. And I know the God of my understanding, who loves me today, heard me, and He gave me the strength, because, I was able to pull this off. Because, like I said in the beginning, I'm a guy who likes to be part of the crowd. I just want to blend in. But God, if you ask God to use you, and you are, you are spiritually fit, watch it, just watch where He sends you, and watch what He does with you. Because the life I have today, one of the other things that Joe told me a long time ago, he told me, he says, everybody who says that AA is going to give you a life beyond your wildest dreams. And I was like, yeah, I've heard that. And he goes, Matt, give up on your wildest dreams. He goes, because if you come up with wild dreams, he says, then you're going to cut off God's handiwork. God could give you, he goes, exactly what, the life that He wants you to have. And like I said, I never pictured that I could be the type of person that, when you say, till death do us part, then they agree to it. I never thought I could be the type of person who could have, kids who could take care of them. I don't do it perfectly, like Derek said last week, and I loved it. So I'm going to have to steal it. It's like, my kids have seen me on page 52. My wife has seen me on page 52. My employers see me on page 52. My home group has seen me on page 52. So I don't walk on water just because I do this work. The but I do this, the places I fall short today, set me up for the places that I can work on tomorrow. One of the things that Derek shared with me, a long time ago, which I just started doing, semi-religiously. I don't do it every night. I'm not going to lie and say I do, but he has a format where you can do your 11 step nightly review, and when you're done, you could hit submit, and it goes to his email inbox. And he, in turn, when he does one, it goes to his guys, inboxes. So when I wake up in the morning, I get to read Derek's nightly review, and and I know what mine was, where I fell short, so I know what I get to work on. So if you plug into the fellowship that you crave and you stay close to that God of your understanding, like I said, I came in here hopeless and helpless, or so I thought. All I did was take a course of action, and out of that course of action, produced a miracle. I was told don't leave till the miracle happens, but it's not my job, okay, to make the miracle happen. God's got the outcome, but it is my job to take care of the footwork. So I can't. I just looked at the clock, and Derek says I'm a big fan of talking. I guess he's right. I was able to kill the whole hour. So thanks guys for having a Zoom format, where I can carry a message that God can take somebody and carry them to a place of miracles happening. And I end a lot of talks with this, just because it means a lot to me. So I'll share it with you guys. Like I said, I grew up with an alcoholic. My dad was active. I am an alcoholic, so my son is growing up with an alcoholic, but it's an alcoholic in recovery. In my big book, I carry this coaster. On one side, and I'll hold it up so you guys can see the camera. On one side is ice cream. On the other side is beer. So I was out at a restaurant with my son, and he slides the coaster across the table to me, and he goes, "Dad," he goes, "do you like ice cream?" He goes, "Or do you like beer?" So I said to him, he was he's like 5 years old at the time. I said, "Well, buddy," I says, "we're out eating ice cream together, because I always make time for my son. I always make sure that, I take him out, what we call dudes time, where just him and I hang out, because I never got that with my dad." And so I said, "Well, buddy, we're having dudes time right now, eating some ice cream. So, Dad likes ice cream." And I turned it over and I showed him the beer. And I says, "Daddy doesn't drink." I says, "I don't like beer." And my 5-year-old son looked at me, and, with all the love in his eyes and all the love in his voice, he goes, "Dad," he goes, "you drink a lot." He goes, "You drink lots of coffee." If you asked me at 5 years old what my dad's drink of choice was, my answer would not have been coffee. So I always get choked up, because, it's like my son looks at me today as a man who drinks too much coffee, not a man who drinks too much alcohol. I spend time with my son so that, even when I snap and he sees me on page 52, because I don't do it perfectly, I do when I tuck him in every night. I do make sure, I says, "Dad loves you, right?" And every night he says, "Yes." He says, "Yes, I do." And I give my son a kiss on the head and a hug, and a hug. And now that my daughter's getting old enough, she gives me a kiss, and, she has to give me a big hug, so when I get a big hug from my daughter, we both have to go, "Arr!" Okay, because that's a big hug. Without it, it's not just a regular hug, and we need a big hug. So I'm raising my kids not in perfection, but spiritual progress, every day, and that they know that they're growing up in a household where there is alcoholism, but there's treated alcoholism. So they're growing up with one where there's love and tolerance. And like I said, so this coaster has a permanent spot in my big book to remind me, that my son never has to see me take a drink, and that my son can see, actually, here's another funny one. I'll actually end with this. Is my son this is 2014, so he's not even 3 years old yet. There's a picture of my son sitting in front of the 12 steps and 12 traditions at my home group. And if you look in front of him, there's a big book. So should my son ever needs it, he's had plenty of exposure to it. And, a buddy of mine always says, "I never liked my drinks watered down, and I don't want my AA watered down." And that's the message of depth and weight, that I carry, that, a non-watered down message from our original 100 men and women. So that should either one of my kids need AA, that it's going to be around for them. And thanks again for letting me share.
Thank you for listening to Sober Sunrise. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a thumbs up, as it will help share the message. Until next time, have a great day.